Aloha, this is me, MarkO, talking, and I welcome you to Dances with Dragons, a Green Heart Foundation podcast. In this podcast, you will hear about my real-life stories and adventures, together with the exciting current projects of our Green Heart Foundation. So, sit back, relax, and get ready to listen. There's Bennie. And he said, so why don't you finish breakfast? I'm going to shower. And he says, I'll take you to introduce you to my closest Tibetan friend. And you're going to start your learning about Buddhism. And I said, well, great. I said, what about jewelry shops and jewelry makers and jewelry stores, jewelers? And he said, I'm going to first introduce you to the world of Buddha sculptures, Buddha Thangka paintings, the real ones, authentic masks, bronze statues, ideal in antiques. And I have clients all over Europe, and I'm going to introduce you to the world of where you can make some money. And I thought, well, gosh, that's way beyond me. I can barely afford a lapis lazuli or a moonstone or a piece of turquoise. I don't think I'm going to really be getting into the antique business anytime soon. Bennie comes up to bring me for lunch to my first Tibetan that I'm going to meet. And we go again to this beautiful tall building that looked like it wasn't a hotel, but it was a very tall building anyway. And it had Tibetan carpets and Tibetan artifacts everywhere. I didn't know they were Tibetan. They just looked very powerful, very spiritual feel. And Setin lived with his family in this very huge house. A lot of the typical wealthier houses were 4 or 5 stories high because they had 8 different families living, attached, connected, next of kin, would all stay in a house, and someone would marry, and then they'd get their own room or two, and they'd have a baby, and then there'd be a bigger room for them. And so Setin was his name, the Tibetan, and so I kept thinking, oh, Setin the Tibetan. But he said, no, it's pronounced Setin. And I thought, wow, Setin. And I commented, I said, that sounds like Satan. Are you the devil? And he looked at me and he says, no, but I can teach you about the devil schools of Buddhism. And I said, devil schools of Buddhism? Yes. And Bennie was very keen. He says, we call this Tantric Buddhism. Do you know that the Dal Lama, who we had heard of in those days, is an incarnation of Kali, the ferocious-looking monster of a woman holding a sword in the right hand and a human skull cut in half, filled with blood in the left hand. And he says the most peaceful man on earth, the Dalai Lama of Tibetan Buddhism, is depicted in his other incarnation as an incarnation of Kali, Mother Kali, his feminine incarnation form. And all of a sudden, I'm learning about the most esoteric schools of Buddhism. And it wasn't just about sitting with your legs crossed and doing Om and meditating at dawn and reaching enlightenment. That was pretty much a lot of my basic understanding of Buddhism, a lot of meditation, teachers, lamas, Rinpoches teaching you. But I'm starting to learn about the devil schools, as they were calling it, because Setin, who played with the name of Satin, he's going to be my best friend from the Himalayas, Buddhist friend from the Himalayas. And so they start teaching me about the inner secret schools of Buddhism. And because I started asking about Bhutan, they became fascinated. How do I know about Bhutan? Most people have never heard of Bhutan. And I said, no, I have studied a little bit about it, and I have read this magazine, and I held up the magazine that I still have here in my bookshelf, the original 1974 edition of the cover of National Geographic, crowning a 19-year-old boy as the King of Bhutan. And they said, we've got some people, some lamas to introduce you to. Let's go out to Boudha. And so I said, what's Boudha? They said, it's a stupa. It's a Buddhist temple that's outside of town. It's about 10 kilometers outside of town. But we know some of the Rinpoches there, the highest Lama that incarnates, called a Rinpoche, and the Lamas, and we'd like to introduce you because this one in particular is from Bhutan. And I said, really? I can meet someone from Bhutan? And so we are now Setin had his own family, so-called taxi, but all wealthier families have their own car with a live-in driver, literally 24/7. Your chauffeur is on call. And I'm starting to realize that I'm being shown my first day in Nepal so much, so quickly, and so esoteric and so deep that I just felt this is some kind of good fortune coming my way. But let's talk about Bhutan. Please teach me about their Buddhism. And I recall that Bhutan being called in their language Land of the Thunder Dragon, that's Druk Yul, Land of Druk Thunder Dragon. That's the name of Bhutan in the Bhutanese language. That's what first drew me to finding Bhutan one day, because Carlos Castaneda, Don Carlos, had taught me about finding my animal ally, which I named to be the dragon, and that I was to go to 3 different countries around the world, 3 lands, he called it, and find the dragon, the source of dragon mythology, the source of dragon lore, the roots of dragon cultures. And so I remember when they pulled up to this Buddhist temple and they had to kind of stop off the dirt road, horrible, horrible roads out of Kathmandu, horrible roads going into Kathmandu. How the monsoons wash away roads all the time. So I'm mesmerized when I walked in the entrance of Boudha Stupa, called Boudha Nath, and it was a stupa that was built. So I walk into the stupa with my friend Bennie and Setin, the Tibetan, and it was the most peaceful, serene. The stupa was 800 years old. Some say there were temples in the places of temples that were built later, like the Mayan pyramids. They will build a pyramid, and after generations and centuries, it'll begin to deteriorate, and they'll build another pyramid on the foundation of the old pyramid. So many of these sacred Buddhist centers, no one really knows what kind of a so-called makeshift temple could have been on that holy site before. But I'm walking in feeling I am home. And there were mostly Tibetans doing their circumnavigation around the stupa. You walk into a Buddhist stupa, usually you go to the left so that you're making a clockwise around the center of the stupa motion. I noticed some of the people were going to the right, and I asked one of the first things when we walked in and started veering to the left, which 99% of the people were doing. Some people were going to the right, and I asked them about the ones going right. They said, those are the special shamans. That's what we're talking about when we want to tell you about the devil, the dark worshippers of Buddhism. And I'm just mystified. Well, what's this devil stuff? And it's simply the deep shamans do things the opposite of the other Buddhists. They're all Buddhists. They all believe in their Buddha. They all have different manifestations and incarnations that they follow as far as their teachers. To differentiate different schools of Buddhism, There are 4 main schools, all practicing the same path of what Buddha laid out 540 years BC before Christ, as these are the Dharma, the teachings, the path, the Sangha, or the followers of Buddhism. 4 different schools. And the 2 primary schools, one headed by Dalai Lama, that's the yellow hat Gelugpa school. The other school is the red hat, headed by Karmapa Rinpoche. These are incarnate lamas who become Rinpoche incarnates, that they take over a lineage when their elder or whenever the teacher passes. It is determined who and when they're going to find within a few years or sooner the replacement young boy, generally always a young child, takes over and has to pass many different tests in Buddhism to determine, is he the one that should inherit an entire school, an entire religion, a religious aspect of Buddhism, temples all over the world. There's a lot of money involved to be the Pope of your school of Buddhism. I'm being led into Boudha Stupa, and the purpose was they wanted to introduce me to a Bhutanese connected young boy incarnate Rinpoche, learning quickly about Himalayan Buddhism, and in particular I'm going to find out about this very esoteric, secretive school that Bhutan practices. And that is simply the Dragon School, Drukpa Kagyu Buddhism, Dragon Red Hat Kagyu School of Buddhism. But they're going to bring me to one of their little temples in the back of Boudha Stupa. So all around this Boudha Stupa complex, there were little teeny dirt mud alleys that would lead to a few little houses, a few little storefronts selling sugar and rice and cooking oil, little mini marts that pop up here and there. But they're bringing me back to one of the Rinpoches that has his little temple room. Sometimes they were simply nothing more than an enlarged room. In the corner of the temple would be a raised up dais bed where a Tibetan carpet would be placed on top, and that's where they slept at night, inside their own temple. I walk into a very dark room. The smells are the things that always captivated me when I got to the Himalayas. And of course, different bazaars. You go through Afghanistan, Turkey, India, Iran, their smells, the incense, the foods, the spices, and the colors. But I'm walking into a very dark room with butter lamps all along a central altar in the center backside of the room. I am now meeting my first Bhutanese. It is my first day in Nepal. The sun is still up in the sky, and meeting Bennie, meeting Setin, having Bharat serve me like the most faithful friend I could ever have dreamed of to manifest at Panorama Hotel. And what transpires next is simply life-changing for me, because I'm being told about where Lama Longdro had his little monastery in this town, outside of the town, on the outskirts of town of Kalimpong, and that there were some very renowned people in exile there. And he named particularly the royal grandmother of the current king of Bhutan. So this young boy who was recently crowned king of Bhutan had a grandmother who was in exile in this town of Kalimpong. And I said, whoa, that seems like an important town. What's going? They said, but also the Shabdung. The Shabdung is in exile in Kalimpong and also in Dharamsala near the Dalai Lama in India. I said, what's the Shabdung? They said, this is the Dalai Lama of Bhutan. And with that, I say farewell. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join us next week. because we are going to go into the deep, dark secrets of the most esoteric school of Himalayan Buddhism, practiced only in Bhutan, this particular dragon school of Buddhism. And they called it Drukpa Kagyu Buddhism. And there is the name of the country, Drukyol. Practicing Buddhists there are called Drukpas, Thunder Dragon Buddhists. And I am entering this sacred school of Buddhism through Lama Longdro, through Setin the Tibetan, and my dear new brother Bennie, who by chance I meet one day, a few hours on the streets of Sweden, the biggest city in Northern Europe. I meet a man that my first day in Nepal, Bouncing Bennie comes up behind me saying, "Namaste. I thought you'd be coming soon. I've been waiting for you." Thank you for listening to Dances with Dragons. I hope you all enjoyed my stories of the adventures of a modern-day Marco Polo. Join us next week to listen to more exciting real-life stories. If you enjoyed our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with others. To learn more about us, please visit our website at greenheartfoundation.org and follow our social media accounts. See you next week.